Hello everyone and welcome. If you enjoyed today's content, please consider subscribing or leaving a like. Thank you. So if you've got elderly parents or grandparents, or just don't live under a rock, you've probably heard before that Britain used to have the densest rail network of anywhere in the world. So what happened? While there were some cuts as early as the 1920s, these were quite limited in scope. However, that would all change at the tail end of the 1950s, when then Tory Prime Minister Harold Macmillan would employ the now infamous Dr Richard Beeching to advise on the most radical cuts yet.
There's never been a doomsday book of British railways like this, and if the government approves, today's report will shape the future of the system. More than 2,000 stations will be closed. Britain is going to be a different place. A new look for a much reduced system could mean eventually 70,000 fewer jobs. Some of the cash compensation has already been agreed with the unions. But make no mistake about this. This is going to be a big upheaval for Britain.
As you can see, this led to the gutting of rail in the north, and everywhere outside of London suffered at least a little bit. And while it was the Conservatives who started these cuts, it was a policy that would be pursued by both Conservative and Labour governments. In the lead-up to the 1964 general election, Harold Wilson rather cynically implied that the cuts would stop under Labour, such as by promising the local constituency Labour Party for Whitby that any closure of the Whitby-Malton line would be covered in the Labour Party manifesto, which it wasn't.
No.
But upon Labour's victory that year, the new Transport Secretary, Tom Fraser, went ahead with the closure.
I lied.
Soon as the cuts were announced by the previous Conservative government, there had been widespread backlash against the plan. In particular to the Whitby-Malton line, the local Tory MP Alex Spearman criticised Beeching's assessment that the line should be closed. Since many of the areas where cuts were made, the arguments surrounding profitability applied just as equally to buses. He highlighted that people unable to drive would be left cut off from the world, and that quite frankly buses, at any rate, would be incapable of dealing with the winter moorland weather.
I want a license.
To kill?
No, to drive.
So why was this done? Dr Beeching was asked to make British Rail profitable to the government. So he found unprofitable lines, and he cut them. But this is a short-sighted and, quite frankly, narrow-minded view of economics. You see, while taking into consideration the tax burden, he failed to consider the relative cost to consumers, or even the relative cost in energy for different transport systems, the energy economics of the problem. The International Energy Agency found that rail is one of the most energy-efficient transport modes, responsible for 9% of global motorised passenger movement and 7% of freight, but only 3% of transport energy use. Research by the European Environmental Agency also supports the claim that rail is by far one of the most energy-efficient transportation systems. You could even make an argument that the Beeching cuts left Britain particularly vulnerable to the energy crises of the 1970s.
With petrol rationing still only a threat in Britain, service stations have introduced their own methods of preventing stockpiling. But the government-recommended speed limit of 50 miles an hour is legally unenforceable.
Not only that, but the short-sightedness of the plan has cost us valuable time in our fight against climate change. I would go as far as to say that anyone serious about a green revolution must pledge to reverse the Beeching cuts. Sadly, the vast majority of people choose to drive over our limited transport systems. This has been sold to us as 1, more convenient, and 2, cheaper. Both of these claims are ridiculous. First, you don't need a license to ride a train or a bus. They're accessible to everyone. Nor do trains suffer from traffic jams. The only time I've had a delay is when something's gone wrong with the track or the train, or there's been some poor sod trying to kill themselves, which, if we're honest, doesn't really happen very often. And I want you to imagine for a second the amount of productivity lost a year from all these people stuck in traffic for hours on end. Secondly, cars are not cheap. Once you get past a few thousand it'll take to buy a cheap car, you have to worry about MOTs, insurance, and gas. Not even to mention repairs and road tax, of course.
Now, this wheel balancing is free, right?
Oh, you betcha, absolutely. Wait a minute. These tires won't take a balance.
They won't?
No. You hear that clunk?
No.
Yeah, that tells me you need 4 new tires.
I'll bet you're wondering why you're now staring at some Swiss rail in a video about British rail. It's very simple. Despite the UK having the most expensive rail prices of anywhere in Europe, we have one of the least developed rail networks. It's Switzerland, a country a fraction of our size, with a much smaller economy and cheaper tickets to boost, that has the most developed rail of Europe. These lines carve straight through their mountains, a feat of engineering befitting a great nation. I hear you say, while Switzerland is a small country, they have less far to spread their money, and this would be true if it wasn't for the fact that we're considering the density of the network here. So really, costs should scale with size. So why is it then that their rail is so much cheaper? Could it be that Swiss rail, like most European rail, is majority state-owned? Well, until I hear a more convincing argument, that's what I'm going with.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
Now imagine for a second you have a farm, but it doesn't actually produce enough for you to sell. And it's obviously costing you money, fertilizing it and seeding it and whatnot each year. However, it does produce enough for you and your family to eat. But you don't have any money whatsoever, so you decide to sell the farm. Now, do you think the new owner will be selling you the food at the same cost it used to cost you to produce it? The answer, if they have any business sense, is obviously not. What would be the incentive for them to invest if they weren't getting some sort of return? You see, with state-owned rail, tickets can be priced at cost, and the profits normally reserved for the fat cat owners can be passed on to the consumers as savings. Now sure, if we were to reverse Beeching, not all the lines would be able to finance themselves off ticket sales alone. There would be some tax burden. But this is actually already the case. You see, it isn't actually ticket sales that finance these companies. In fact, they often lose money operating these lines. In fact, when companies fail to meet their target revenue, they're bailed out. This is called the cap and collar approach, and can be the case even when the line is profitable. Argued that this is to create a competitive bidding war between companies.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong.
All it really does is incentivize those companies to massively exaggerate what they're capable of delivering. The truth is that the government knows full well that many lines can have years of unprofitability, and yet these lines can still be essential. But the Conservatives, being who they are, could never accept a state-owned rail, so instead they nationalise the losses and privatise the profits. And then there's this from the BBC. Go Ahead defends rail profits after government bailout. The transport company Go Ahead has defended its multi-million-pound rail profits, despite the industry benefiting from a £10 billion government bailout. The Newcastle-based company, which runs South Eastern and Govia Thames Link, recorded a rail operating profit of £6.5 million for the second half of 2020. The chief executive, David Brown, said its services were an absolute bargain for the taxpayers. But RMT General Secretary Mike Cash said the profits were beyond belief. The government has effectively nationalised all the risks on our railways, but profits and dividends remain privatised, he said. It's beyond belief that despite the pandemic, these private train companies are still extracting fat profits and dividends out of the rail network, while staff at the front line are confronted with threats of a pay freeze and attacks on jobs, pensions and conditions. But all David Brown had to say in reply was, "They're paying us to be an efficient operator and to run a service according to their specification for which we receive a management fee. Why would we do it otherwise? You'll not get that cheaper for a nationalised industry. This is an absolute bargain." Liar! Liar! But despite the talk, Go Ahead recorded an overall pre-tax profit of £24.6 million for the 6 months to the 2nd of January of this year, down from 49 the previous year. Pre-tax profits are one thing. How much are these companies actually paying out in dividends each year? Passenger's cash also ends up lining the pockets of the owners of the operating companies. These include Stagecoach's biggest shareholders, co-founders, Sir Brian Shooter and his sister, and Globe. Their 26% stake earned them £17 million in dividends last year. As chief executive, Sir Brian got £8.4 million from 2010 to 2013. Virgin Trains' UK parent company, Virgin UK Holdings, ultimately owned by the Sir Richard Branson, paid out a £479 million dividend last summer.
Oh, there's only one thing better than owning a vault full of cold, hard cash, and that's swimming in it. I love to dive around in it like a porpoise, and burrow through it like a gopher, and toss it up and let it hit me on the head.
The article continues. In our capitalist system, profits are a payment for a combination of two things, a return on investment and a reward for the risk of losing that money. In the railways, neither of these factors applies. The train operating companies in this investigation make no investment in the railways. They do not own the trains, the stations, or the track. Moreover, there is no risk of bankruptcy. If a train firm gets into financial trouble, it can walk away from the contract. Train services have to keep running, and the government will take over. Of course, companies pay for the odd improvement, such as better toilets or refurbished carriages, but that is taken into account in the bids for the franchises. So it is effectively the government that funds these investments. The huge sums paid to railway bosses are therefore undeserved. They are not risk-taking capitalists creating wealth. They are merely running a public service which cannot be allowed to fail, and ultimately, the money is coming from us. But ultimately, this is about far more than just money in economics. This is about preserving our history. This is about reclaiming something that was stolen from us. Let me just tell you all a story. A businessman who campaigned to save a historical railway station says he is devastated to see it being pulled down. Nigel Richardson, a former councillor and mayor of Kirby Moorside, had considered selling his own house to save the town station, which closed in the 1960s. I've lived in the town all my life, and this is part of my history. I feel betrayed and devastated that the station is being pulled down. Helmsley still has a station house, as does Norton and Sillington, and Pickering has a working station, so why does Kirby Moorside have to suffer? I wrote to the English Heritage site to try and get the station listed, but was told that there were too many similar buildings in the area. I then looked at selling my own house and buying the station, but to buy the site was going to cost £1.5 million, which is way above what I could afford. Mr. Richardson, who runs a private hire company, said he felt he had let Kirby Moorside down. He said, "I just feel I didn't fight hard enough for the town, and to see the station being dismantled is like the final nail in the coffin. I feel like leaving Kirby Moorside altogether. I was born and bred in this town, and remember watching the trains when I was going to school. I'm not a railway buff, I'm just a local person who feels like our local history is being destroyed." And now doesn't that just show you the strength of feeling surrounding these odd lines? That there are still people fighting to preserve what little piece of them remains.
Remote areas of the Highlands will lose their passenger services. North of Aberdeen, very few will be left. And south of Edinburgh, too, many local passenger services will go. In Wales, too, they're drastically reduced. Many of the country services are doomed, leaving only 3 main links east and west. And a shock for the north, the holiday coast will have no more stopping trains. Holiday resorts in the West Country share the fate of many market towns, no station, no passenger trains. And North Devon and North Cornwall resorts are especially hit. In the northeast, little more than the main north-south links will remain.
Thou's gonna catch thy death the cold. Thou's gonna catch thy death the cold. On hill climb or batat, on hill climb or batat, on hill climb or batat.